Good afternoon, and welcome to the 18th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm John Parrish Peety, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. NEH is proud to sponsor this year's Understanding Our World stage. An independent federal agency, NEH was established in 1965, and our agency was part of LBJ's Great Society legislation. And the NEH and our sister agency, the NEA, still follow that original mission. Our agency supports museum exhibitions, documentaries, books that bring history, literature, philosophy, archaeology, and other humanities fields to the public. We fund the preservation of historical records, collections, and objects. We sponsor educational opportunities for teachers and students in the humanities. And we underwrite fundamental research across all disciplines of the humanities, both by professors as well as by independent scholars. Our distinguished guest today, Gordon S. Wood, has long ties to NEH. Not only has he received NEH grants as far back as 1967, some 50 years ago, when we were an infant federal agency, he was awarded the 2010 National Humanities Medal by the President of the United States. And you will have a chance to meet him yourself shortly after this presentation at 6:30 p.m., where he'll be signing books at line number 11 on the lower level. And I'll say both to this audience and to the public at large, Gordon Wood hardly needs an introduction. Once described as, quote, an almost an American institution by the New York Times, Wood has profoundly shaped our understanding of America's democratic institutions and the visions of the founders who laid out their blueprint. He is the author and the editor of 25 books, including the Pulitzer Prize winning The Radicalism of the American Revolution and the Creation of the American Republic, for which he was awarded the Bancroft Prize. He is the Alva Way University professor and professor of history emeritus at Brown University. And I'll say, too, on a personal note, I had the pleasure of going to grad school with his daughter, Amy, who is herself a fine and important historian. And throughout his long career as historian, Wood has focused on the pivotal period after 1776 in which our nation was forged and unpacked for us the essential radicalism of the founding era. In a letter dated July 1813, John Adams wrote to his political rival and sometimes friend Thomas Jefferson, quote, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." And of course, the latest book that we're celebrating today, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Wood fulfills Adams' wish, explaining the ideals that brought these two men together and the philosophical differences that led to the original schism in their friendship. And I will say that these letters are compiled, edited, and published through decades of NEH support. And since we are a federally funded agency, that is through your support. So thank you. Professor Wood will be in conversation with philanthropist and co-founder of the Carlyle Group, David Rubenstein. Deeply invested in the practice of patriotic philanthropy, Rubenstein's generosity has done much to preserve the monuments and records of our founding era. Those of us in D.C. are grateful to his financial support in creating the National Archives Visiting Center, repairing the Washington Monument after it was damaged by the earthquake, and sponsoring the current expansion of the Kennedy Center. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not say that the book festival as we know it simply would not be occurring without his support, his vision, and sponsorship. Thank you. Thank you. Now, and if you'll allow me a few sentences before we get to the main event, what comes to mind for me when I think about these gentlemen and what they have achieved is the 1816 letter that Jefferson wrote, and he said, quote, "A nation that expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization expects what never was, It never will be. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome these two gentlemen who have done as much as anyone I can think of as a living Americans to help us have a society that is both free and informed.
Thank you. So, why don't we start with the Second Continental Congress? At that Congress, John Adams is the dominant figure. Is that fair to say?
Yes, by all means.
And he was dominant because he was the principal person who thought that we should secede from the British Empire.
Right.
Okay. So he was then probably in his 40s, I guess it was. Mm-hmm. And Thomas Jefferson was new. He hadn't been at the First Continental Congress.
That's right.
He comes to the Second Continental Congress. He's only 33 or so. He goes begrudgingly. He doesn't really want to be there. Is that right?
No, I think he wanted to go to the first, but he became ill, and he sent a pamphlet instead, or some instructions, which turned into a pamphlet. His fellow delegates from Virginia published it without his permission, and it became the most radical pamphlet at that time in the whole debate with Great Britain. This was a summary view of the relationship. And until Thomas Paine's Common Sense, it was the most radical pamphlet.
Okay, so he goes there. He's in the second. His wife was ill at the time of the Second Continental Congress. He didn't really want to be there, I thought, but he gets there, and ultimately, John Adams proposes a resolution, in effect, that says we should break away from England. Is that right?
Right. Well, others proposed the resolution, but I think that certainly is. He was the proponent, the most eager delegate for independence.
So he's the most eager delegate for independence, and ultimately the delegates don't have the right to break away from England. They haven't been given that authority from the legislatures. So I think Adams and Richard Henry Lee basically say to the delegates, let's pass a resolution that goes back and get the authority. Is that more or less right?
Well, they pass in May. You're talking about the May resolutions, which essentially were written by Adams.
Right.
And they essentially gave advice to the colonies that they should suppress all mention of royal authority. So it's tantamount to a Declaration of Independence, which Adams felt was the real Declaration of Independence.
Okay,
which,
get to that.
Of course, later on, he tried to claim that he had anticipated the...
Right, so the delegates go back to their 13 colonies, but while they're back, there's a committee that's appointed to deal with this situation. If they come back and they vote for independence, they want to explain why they're doing this.
Right.
So they decide to have a committee, and there were lots of committees in those days in the Congress, but they have a committee appointed to figure out how they should describe what they're going to do. And who's on that committee?
Well, there are five representatives, and they're sectionally, depending on location, a New Englander, a New Yorker, two New Englanders, a New Yorker, and a Virginian. And so they represent, and Jefferson and Adams are both on the committee.
Right.
Jefferson's the young man. Adams is on about 24 committees in the Congress, and so he's on the Board of War, which is essentially conducting the war effort against Great Britain. So he's very busy, and so let's let this young guy who just joined us, let him go off and write the thing. Little did Adams realize how important the Declaration would become. He would have written it himself. He was appalled later on, of course, by the acclaim that Jefferson was getting. Neither Jefferson nor Adams knew how important the Declaration would become in time.
Well, Adams, I thought, originally said something like, well, I'm not that popular, and you are not as disliked as I am, so you should write it. But also, he was from Massachusetts, and maybe somebody from Virginia would be better. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, that was true. But both colonies were, of course, in the lead. But they also, Adams also said, you're a good man with a pen. Because of his summary review pamphlet, Jefferson had already acquired a reputation for being facile and good in his writing. So it was a natural thing, but Jefferson was a junior member. And it was not at all in Adams's mind that this was going to amount to anything important.
So Jefferson has, I think, roughly 17 days to write it. Like most humans, he waits till the end. So he has, with about 3 days to go, he sits down and writes the Declaration of Independence, takes it back to the committee. And the committee, they're happy with it, and
Yeah,
they
they
edited
make a few changes, but minor things, yeah, Jefferson,
And one of the people on the committee is an editor named Benjamin Franklin, so he edits a little bit.
right?
All right, so then the delegates come back. They vote ultimately to be independent. That vote occurs on July the 2nd.
Second.
So what does Adams say to his wife
Well,
then?
he thought that that would be the day that would be celebrated with bonfires and fireworks and what became the 4th of July. He missed it by 2 days. He didn't realize that the actual declaration, the pamphlet or the document would become the important thing rather than the vote itself. And so he missed it, but he got the notion that it was important, right.
All right, so on July the 2nd, they vote to be independent. On July the 3rd and July the 4th, they take up the Declaration of Independence. And do they just take whatever Jefferson has written, or do they modify it?
No, they make some changes. Oh, the Congress makes some very serious changes. About 40% of the Declaration is changed, particularly on the slavery question, and Jefferson's suffering through all of these changes. Franklin makes jokes to him about it, referring to a hatter, I think, a sign, and so on. And it becomes a humorous incident, but not for Jefferson. He really suffered having...
Jefferson never says a
No
word.
author likes to have his words cut out.
But during this debate, it's alleged that Jefferson never said a word. He didn't say, don't edit this, or he says nothing. Why does he say nothing?
Well, he defers to... He's not a public man. He does not like speaking out. He was good in small committees, but he's not an orator. Completely different from Adams in that respect. Adams is always on his feet, always arguing, always debating. Jefferson, not at all.
Okay, so ultimately, they agree that the text on the 4th of July, it's printed up, it's sent around to everybody, they know what the text is, and then the Continental Congress more or less disbands as they go to fight the war. Where does Adams go and where does Jefferson go after the Second Continental Congress? What are they doing?
Well, Adams is finally assigned to go abroad to negotiate a treaty. He was going to negotiate the treaty with France, an alliance. And he arrives, but it's already been accomplished by others, including, of course, Franklin, who has been there from the very beginning, 1776. And so Adams is over there, and he's got nothing else to do. So he goes to Holland and becomes a very important figure in extracting money from the Dutch, and also becoming the first to get the Dutch, the second country to recognize the United States. And Jefferson goes back home, and eventually ends up becoming governor of the state, of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the new state. And a very unhappy experience for him because he mishandles some events. But he would love to get abroad himself and is asked later, but can't leave because of first there are difficulties with ships, and then there's difficulties with his wife's illness.
But in that period of time, during the war, when the war is being fought from essentially 1776 to 1781, the relationship between Adams and Jefferson is okay?
Yeah, I think there's one letter exchange. They had known each other, but they're not close until Jefferson finally comes abroad as one of the ministers to deal with treaties of commerce following the declaration of the acceptance of the peace treaty by Great Britain. So that when they're together in Paris, that's when the two families really come together. Or Jefferson's a widower at this point, and Abigail has joined John, and John Quincy Adams, the young son, is there, and Jefferson is adopted, so to speak, as a member of the family. He's lonely. He's got his daughters there, but their daughters are in school, and he becomes a member of the Adams family, and it takes to them really. I think that's when the relationship is most enriched. They become intermingled. Jefferson would take John Quincy to a concert or to a museum. They would go to places in Paris together. And then, of course, when Adams is appointed as Minister of the United States to Great Britain, they go off to London, but they exchanged letters back and forth. Abigail herself writing to Thomas Jefferson, and they exchanged presents. And there's a little flirtation that goes on between Jefferson. Not much by our standards, but in one letter, Jefferson writes to Abigail, I was going to purchase a little statue of Venus for your dining room, but then I realized that having two Venuses in the same room would be too much. That's Jefferson flirting. He was with Abigail. He's really taken with Abigail. He never has met a woman like her who knew so much about literature, who had read the same things he had read, Shakespeare, Milton. She could quote things from memory, and at the same time was a household manager. And the combination to him was just overwhelming, and he really is taken with the Adams family.
Right.
I think that's the point where the two men really are close, and that is where the bonds of affection are really sealed.
When Jefferson is over there, he asked to have his younger daughter sent over to France so he could meet with her. Hadn't seen her in a couple years. Daughter didn't want to go, but eventually they trick her to going on a boat. And she's accompanied by a young slave whose name is?
Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings and the Polly come to London first, and Abigail takes them in and hosts them for a few weeks, waiting for Jefferson to come to London to pick them up. But Jefferson doesn't do that, much to Abigail's surprise. He sends another person, an agent, to pick up his daughter. That's when Sally joins
she's 14
Jefferson's
years
household.
She's 14 years old then.
Very young at that point, and presumably she's one of these young women who really blossomed in the next couple of years. By the time she's 16, she's a woman instead of just...
The age of consent in Virginia those days was 12.
Well, I don't think there was much in terms of consent that was needed in this case, but this is the relationship with Sally as a concubine, and it's the Paris experience that helps explain it, because Sally came, her brother was already there, James. James Hemings has been brought over by Jefferson to learn how to cook French style. And he's going to come back to Monticello and become the chef at Monticello. He, being in France, he could, and James is older than Sally, he's about 20, he realizes he can walk out the door and be free under French law. He uses that leverage to negotiate a deal with Jefferson that, look, I will come back to Monticello and train another servant, as Jefferson referred to them, to learn how to cook French style, if you'll then free me. Jefferson does that, makes that deal, and presumably he makes the same deal with James's sister, Sally, which she does not want to be freed, but she wants her children freed when they're adults. And that's the deal, as one of the Hemings boys' offspring, Jefferson's offspring, says later in his memoir, the deal that my mother made with Mr. Jefferson.
That's Madison.
Madison.
And did Jefferson honor that commitment?
Yes, he does. He lets of course, by that time, the law in Virginia was they were octoroons. That is, the boys, the Hemings boys are octoroons. They're 1/8 black, and there's no one drop rule in Virginia at that point. And they are legally white. And so, as you know today, when the Hemings and Jefferson heirs get together, many of the Jefferson heirs, many of the Hemings heirs are white, and others are black. So some of them, the Hemings successors, passed as white. They were only 1/8 white. Sally herself was a quadroon, and so she was the half-sister, if you can believe this, of Jefferson's wife.
In other words, Sally Hemings' father was a white slave owner, but he was also the father of Jefferson's wife, right?
Of Betty Hemings. He's the father of Jefferson's wife, but he's also has a
Right.
concubine himself, Betty Hemings, who was herself a half.
Right. So some people say when Jefferson saw this 14-year-old girl, he was seeing his wife as a younger.
Well, it could be. She may have resembled, since she's the half-sister, she may have resembled.
So let's go back to the Jefferson-Adams relationship. So George Washington's elected president of the United States unanimously, and John Adams is elected vice president.
Right.
And this is in 1790.
1788 is the election, and 1789.
Right, 1788. Right, and they take office in 1789.
1789, right.
So Jefferson is still in France. He comes back, and 3 months after the election, he's told what?
Well, he finds out that Washington has appointed him Secretary of State without informing him that he was going to be Secretary of State, and he takes the position. It's a great honor to.
Okay, so he becomes Secretary of State, and eventually Jefferson falls out with Washington and he resigns. Right. Why did he fall out with Washington?
Well, he and Hamilton clash. They have very different views. Hamilton has a program to make over the United States in the image of Great Britain, a fiscal military state, a standing army, with debt, solving the debt problem, consolidating the debt, and making the United States in time a state, a nation that could take on the European states on their own terms. That's very different from the vision that Jefferson has. He wants a very different. Jefferson is a radical, a liberal radical of the 18th century who feels that armies and war machines are dangerous. They lead to fighting, and they can only cause harm to the international order. And so Jefferson is as radical a liberal as an elected official could be. He and Thomas Paine do not differ one bit in their ideas of government. Adams is a very different kind of person. He's a conservative.
So Washington serves 2 terms and decides not to serve a third. He could serve, presumably. There was no prohibition at that time. So then who's running for president then?
Well, it's Adams assumes that he would be the natural successor. And he's a little surprised to see that the merging new party, the Republican Party, led by Madison and Jefferson, is the candidate. And Jefferson comes in second in electoral votes. In those days, the party system is not, we don't have the 12th Amendment, so that the person who got the most electoral votes gets to be president. The person who gets the second most electoral votes gets to be vice president. And so you have this awkward situation where a Federalist, Adams, is president, and a Republican, an opposition party, although these parties are not like our modern parties, the opposition party is the leader is a vice president.
So in those days, the vice president didn't have that much to do, maybe preside over the Senate, but the Congress is only meeting a couple months a year. So Jefferson really doesn't spend that much time with Adams, if at all.
Right. He at first Jefferson thought that this was ideal. He actually defers to Adams, and he thought maybe this would end the partisan conflict. And he writes a letter to Adams, more or less asking for a kind of accommodation. Look, we can get along, and so on. But he says, I better show this to my colleague James Madison, and Madison says, don't send that letter. Madison is far shrewder in that sense about politically. He says that's going to cause you embarrassment later because this conflict between us, meaning the Republicans, and the Federalists is not normal politics. That's going to become more serious, and that letter is going to come back and haunt you. So Jefferson does not send it. And he simply withdraws from the government, does not get involved. He's not, and Adams comes to realize that his fellow Federalists do not want Jefferson or Madison involved in the government at all. And you have a really serious split between the two parties, much more serious than anything we have today, as hard as that may be to believe.
So Adams is, like most presidents, going to run for a second term, and he runs for a second term, and is it easy for him to get elected again?
He assumed that he would be easily elected the way Washington was, but suddenly his former friend ousts him, and Jefferson gets the more electoral votes, and Adams is humiliated. He's furious, and he refuses to attend Jefferson's inaugural and leaves on a 4 o'clock stage that day.
So
the only other person who did that was John Quincy Adams, his son, when he's ousted after one term by Andrew Jackson.
So Adams takes the carriage back to Braintree, Massachusetts.
Right.
But how long does that actually take to get there in those days?
Oh, several days, a week or so.
Weeks,
more,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, so Jefferson's president, Adams is stewing in Massachusetts. Did they have any conversation or correspondence at that period of time when Jefferson?
No, not after 1800.
So for 8 years, they essentially had no communication.
Right. Well, there is what Abigail writes in 1804 when Polly, the young daughter that she had hosted in London, dies. And so she had just lost a son, so she's feeling very sympathetic towards Jefferson. She writes a letter of condolence to Jefferson, and it really, Jefferson takes it and I think assumes more than he should have, because he writes back a very friendly letter, except he says at the end of the letter, he says, look, your husband and I have agreed on every issue, which is not true. Jefferson was, of course, notoriously disingenuous in his correspondence with people. He said, but we agreed on almost everything. There's only one thing that I objected to in your husband's administration, and that was the appointment of the midnight judges.
These were judges right before Adams left office.
Adams is elected in November, but in those days, the new president did not take office until March. So Adams, in that interval, appoints a whole bunch of judges, including John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Jefferson and the Republicans are furious at those appointments, and when they get into office, they eliminate this whole appellate system that Adams had. But he makes that criticism. He says, that's the only thing, Mrs. Adams, that I objected to. Well, that's not satisfactory to Abigail. She's furious. She comes back with an attack on Jefferson and defending her husband. And Jefferson writes back trying to accommodate her, and she comes back even harsher the next letter, and Jefferson throws up his hands and gives up. If he had avoided that, I think it might have led to something. If he had avoided criticizing Mr. Adams in any way, Abigail might have got her husband into correspondence with Jefferson.
Is there any lingering animosity because July the 2nd is not considered the big day compared to July the 4th, or that's not a problem?
No, I don't think that. The problem comes when the July the 4th and the Declaration itself, the written document, takes on enhanced importance. And that starts in the 90s. The break from England, which was the important part in 1776, is irrelevant by 1790s. But what's important is the second paragraph, all men are created equal, and so on. That becomes the rallying cry of the Republican Party. And Jefferson is extolled as the leader of the Republican Party who had written these famous words. And Jefferson suddenly realizes, well, this is really important. He had no idea in 1776 it would become important. And so he at this point in the early 19th century, he writes to his son-in-law, look, the desk on which I wrote the Declaration is going to become a relic. I'm going to give it to you. He realizes that this is going to make him famous. It really is an extraordinary change. And of course, it drives John Adams jealous. I mean, he's so jealous of this reputation that Jefferson has acquired. And Jefferson, of course, lists that as the first accomplishment he wants posted on his gravestone.
So ultimately, Jefferson finishes his term, 2 terms as president, and he goes back to Monticello, right?
Right.
And then somebody decides it'd be a good idea for Adams and Jefferson to kind of be friendlier.
Benjamin Rush, who was a mutual friend, though he's closer to Adams than he is to Jefferson, works 2 years to bring these two men, these two patriots back together. He thinks it's important for the country that the Northerner and the Southerner should correspond. And he's the person that made it possible for them to come together. And they finally, he's saying, he loves you. And finally, Adams writes a letter to Jefferson, breaks the ice, and then the letters flow for the next 14 years. With Adams writing about 2 to every one of Jefferson's. Jefferson's embarrassed by that, and Adams says, well, look, you're probably busier than I am. And he says, well, so he asks him, how many letters did you receive last year? And this is 1820. And Jefferson says, well, I received 1,200 and something. Well, Adams is appalled, he says, and embarrassed. He says, I only received 120. I mean, 1/10 of what, you see, Jefferson is an international superstar already. He's corresponding with the Tsar of Russia, with Alexander Humboldt, the great German naturalist. There's no comparison. Adams is in a different league, in celebrity league than Jefferson. And that's still true. I mean, we have this great monument in this city to Jefferson, right off the tidal basin, right off the mall. Monticello is visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. There's nothing like that numbers that go to Adams's home in Quincy. In fact, I found out recently that during the off-season, they closed the place, his home, on weekends. The National Park Service runs it. The two men are in two different spheres of celebrity, and that was true then, and it's still true today.
50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence is agreed to, both men are ill, and what happens to them?
Well, as everyone seems to know, or most people know, they died on the same day, July 4th, the Jubilee celebration, 50 years since 1776. And it's such a coincidence that the nation can only conclude that it's providential. Of course, there's a little bit of manipulation. These men are dying, but they're hanging on as best they can because they know the importance of July 4th. And Jefferson at one point says to his physician, is it the 4th yet? And he says, no, sir, it's only the 3rd. And so Jefferson's got to hang on a few hours more. And Adams, the same thing. He wakes up and he says, is this the 4th? And they said, yes, sir. And so he's prepared. Right. To some extent, they can engineer that. But they didn't take any drugs, as far as I know.
So when Jefferson sends a letter to Adams, or Adams sends a letter to Jefferson, how long does it actually take to get these letters?
Well, a week.
Week or so? Okay. And when Jefferson writes a letter, he has a way of keeping a copy. How does that work?
Well, he had a machine that he had worked out where he would write and it would be duplicated. Jefferson's a gadget man, and somebody who loved that kind of.
What did Adams do?
Well, Adams, I think at one point he's having somebody write letters for him. His eyes had become.
But how did he keep copies of them?
Well, he would have them copied over.
Okay, I see. Now, given your expertise in so many areas, but let's focus on the Revolutionary War in the time we have available. Let me ask you a couple of questions that might be on everybody's mind. Could we have won the Revolutionary War without George Washington?
Well, it's hard to think. I think we could have. I think someone else would have emerged, but it would have been difficult. I think more important was Washington's presidency, holding the sections together. The war probably could have been won. I think the British, after the initial year, really had an impossible situation. Trying to fight a war 3,000 miles away, rebellion of the sort, it was similar to what we faced in Vietnam. An insurgent population is not easily put down when you're so far away. Oh. So I think the British were doomed.
You think they could have won the war if they had done
At the outset, they might have been able to do it if they'd come in harshly, but they didn't. They were conciliatory because they kept thinking, well, if we're too harsh, we won't be able to bring them back. We have to win their minds and hearts. And that's not the way to win war, and that it simply didn't work.
Now, do you think Jefferson and Washington and Adams, for that matter, and maybe Benjamin Franklin, are sitting in heaven saying, how come Hamilton has a play about him and we have no play? Was Hamilton really as important as that play might indicate or not?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important, which you haven't emphasized in this conversation, is that how different Jefferson and Adams were from each other. They differed on every single major point you could think of, except for the acceptance of the Revolution. But the one thing they had in common was a deep and abiding hatred of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was important in consolidating the debt and getting that solved at the outset of Washington's administration, and that is crucial. Although that's not Miranda's point. Miranda is emphasizing his immigrant status. And of course, he comes from the Nevis, the West Indies. He's not, in that sense, a member of one of the colonies that became part of the United States. And that becomes, for Adams, he makes him out to be a foreigner. And some historians have somehow mixed that up because Nevins is a British colony, and so no different from Massachusetts as a British colony. So Hamilton is as much an American as John Adams. But Adams liked to emphasize that he was a bastard brat from a foreign bastard brat. They hated Hamilton, both of them. And that's one thing I think they had in common. But everything else, they differed. They differed on all men are created equal. They differed on the exceptionalism of America, which Jefferson created. He's the inventor of American exceptionalism. We are a special country with a special role to play in the world. Adams said that's nonsense. We are just as vicious, just as corrupt and as other nations. Jefferson's notion that all men are created equal, which of course was the Enlightenment notion. It was conventional wisdom for Enlightenment figures. Adams took it on. Adams took on every myth that we have as Americans. He said the idea that we're all created equal is just poppycock. And he tells Jefferson and others, he says, I went to a foundling hospital in Paris and I saw babies who were 4 days old. And already I saw the inequalities. Some of these babies were beautiful, some were ugly, some were smart, and some were stupid at 4 days. And so Adams is committed to the notion of, if we talk in modern terms, of nature, not nurture. Jefferson, and I think Americans in general, at the time, the enlightened part of Americans, and today I think most of us are committed to the idea of nurture. Adams said, don't count on education to change that. We're born unequal and we'll remain unequal, and education can't do much about it. That's not a very American belief. Jefferson was committed to the notion of education. So these two men differ in fundamental ways and represent two different parts of America.
The sentence you referred to earlier in the preamble of the Declaration is probably the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Right.
But what did Jefferson really mean? He never actually said what he meant by all men are created equal. He had several hundred slaves, so how could he say all men are created equal? What did he really mean?
He accepted, of course, he meant all white men. But that is not unique to Jefferson. Enlightenment figures at the time, this is a serious rejection of the ancien regime, which of course was committed to the notion of, they didn't know about DNA, but they knew about inherited, because they had trained their animals, if nothing else. They knew about inheritance, and they believed in aristocracy running in the blood. The Enlightenment is rejecting that and saying that that's not what counts. We're all the same at birth. And any difference, and of course they weren't blind to the differences of adults. They said, of course everyone's different, but that's due to different environments, being raised in different worlds. And if we can somehow get the education straight, we will become more equal. And this is what Adams challenges. I mean, that belief is fundamental to our Americanism, I think, that Jeffersonian belief, which is what gives him his spot in our pantheon. Adams was taking that on. He took that on directly, and he took on the notion of American exceptionalism. So he's a deep conservative, but not a Ronald Reagan conservative. He's sour and cynical about human nature. He doubts democracy. He says sooner or later, our elections will become so partisan, so corrupt, that we will have to have the Senate and the president serve for life. And eventually they'll have to become hereditary, the way the English have, the House of Lords and the King. So he's not a part of the American mainstream, but he's realistic, he's cynical, and he is a believer in what he calls stubborn facts.
If you had a chance to ask John Adams one question and Jefferson one question, what would you ask them?
What I'd like to know about Jefferson, why didn't you ever admit that Sally Hemings was your concubine? Because other planters did. They recognized their offspring by giving them presents at Christmas and so on. Jefferson has nothing.
He never
like
said,
that.
he was accused of this at the time, but he never
admits
he never
it
admitted,
and,
never
and
denied it.
indirectly denies it. But he enters the birth of these offspring in his farm book, along with new heifers and new pigs, child born of Sally Hemings. That's in his farm book. Those are his offspring.
Right?
So
what would you
he's
ask
pretty
Adams?
brutal about that.
What would you ask Adams?
That's a good question. Why did he want to get reconciled with Thomas Jefferson? I think that would be an interesting question.
Okay, and if you could summarize in 30 seconds what you would like all Americans to know about the Revolutionary War, what would be the most important thing they should know about the Revolutionary War?
It's the most important event in American history, bar none. It created, not only legally created the United States, but it infused into our culture all our noblest ideals and aspirations. All men are created equal, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Think of that phrase. I just read the speech by Napal on the universal truth, and he focuses on that phrase. He says, that's an unbelievable phrase, that individuals have the right to pursue happiness. Think about that. So the revolution creates those ideals, and that's why it's such an important event. That's what Lincoln used to get through the Civil War. And if we forget the revolution, then we're in trouble. So
if you'd like to learn more about this, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson by Gordon Wood. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. Thank you.